Jump! Hello YouTube, it's Accurate again, back with another video from the home studio, and today I want to talk a little bit about this new piece of gear called the Novation Circuit Rhythm.
Accurate beats.
So basically this is a sampler and a step-based 8-track sequencer. I'm using the term step-based here and I want to touch on that a little bit later in the video, but yeah. It's not a controller, it's a completely standalone unit with a built-in battery that, according to Novation, holds up to 4 hours of charge, which is cool. So the 8 different tracks on the sequencer are all monophonic by nature, but that doesn't mean that they can only hold one single sample. Take the kick and the snare, for instance, and put them on track 1. As long as they don't overlap or play simultaneously, you can use the tracks like that, if that makes sense. By the way, the name Rhythm here might kind of indicate that it's mainly supposed to be used for drum sounds or single one-shot samples, but you know me, if a unit can sample and then chop samples somewhat decently, of course I'm not just gonna use it for drums, that's for sure. But don't get too excited just yet. This one is $399 plus tax, and you know, it's this small. So I don't really think it competes with anything like the Machine Plus or any of the newer MPCs, at least not for a sample-based producer like myself. A better comparison might be the SP404 from Roland, even though that does a few things better and a few things worse. Or maybe the model samples from Electron, even though that one can't really sample into it, it just plays back samples. But I think the Circuit Rhythm is something of its own. It's kind of unique actually, and since I haven't played around with any of the circuits before and I'm new to the workflow, I find this one to be really fun to work with. It makes music making as fun as it should be, and not having a display or a screen just makes you use your ears and listen to what you're doing in terms of anything. Which is actually kind of necessary sometimes. You know, it's easy to obsess too much about values and numbers and waveforms and stuff. Here, that's not even an option. We're just scratching the surface of what the Circuit Rhythm actually is. And before we dig deeper into the cool stuff like the sampler and the sequencer, let's talk about the connectivity real quick. Starting with the stereo pair of inputs for sampling, followed by a headphone jack, a stereo output, an analog sync out, MIDI in, out and through, a micro SD card reader, and a USB-C connection for both power and data. And that's pretty much what it offers. I think it's kind of cool to see these full-size MIDI connections on a small device like this. I don't need to use any breakout cables or stuff like that. It's easily connectable to anything. The pads feel good and are velocity sensitive, but for someone like me who comes from, you know, Machine and MPCs and stuff like that, they are kind of small to the size, but they work. I like the feeling of the encoders as well. They have a nice resistance to them without being too much, and you know, the whole thing is built out of plastic without really feeling too cheap or fragile. I think that's kind of impressive. Now let's talk about what really made me excited about this one in the first place, which is the sampling.
Slow.
Just to not confuse anyone, all the frustrating loading times that I'm gonna talk about in a minute was edited out of that video clip you just saw for demonstration purposes. So, first of all, it allows you to sample up to 32 seconds of audio into a single track. Then you're able to play that sample back either in sliced mode or in keyboard mode. The keyboard mode basically just pitches the sample around chromatically, and then you're able to use the pads pretty much like a piano keyboard and play melodies like that. Monophonically though, so one note at a time. So you can't sample one single note and then build a chord by playing multiple notes at the same time. It's monophonic like that, so that won't work. But still, kind of a cool thing to have for playing bass lines or melodies or something like that. But if you instead want to play your sample in slice mode, that's not a problem, but the sample gets chopped up into 16 equally long slices on these 16 pads down here. You are able to adjust the start and the length of the different slices individually, but if you want to change your pitch, for instance, that change applies to the entire track, not to the pad. Same goes for adjusting filters or stuff. That's on the track, not per pad, which is kind of a limitation, but you know, you could work around that with other functionality that's built into this one. Resampling stuff or using more tracks than just one for that type of workflow. And if you're looking for a slice point to like place it precisely where you want it, you're gonna have to like trigger the sample, hold shift and adjust your start point, try it out again and do that thing back and forth a few times, because this knob doesn't really scale well to a sample that's 32 seconds long, but that's just what it is. Playing your samples in slice mode also allows you to change them between one-shot, gated, loop, reversed and choke mode, which becomes even more powerful when you think about it. I also want to add here that the circuit rhythm seems to be pretty slow when it comes to handling its own memory, because if I sample 32 seconds of audio into the unit, of course it takes 32 seconds, and then to save the file, it takes an additional 54 seconds for it to save into the unit, which of course isn't the end of the world, but if you're trying to sample a few different things back and forth, it takes a bit of time and it gets a little bit frustrating. But again, the name is rhythm, so sampling like individual drum sounds or shorter one-shots doesn't take that much time. It's not a problem like that, but just when you're trying to use it the way I do, it becomes, yeah, you know what I'm trying to say. The rhythm is also compatible with Novation's own components software for handling like samples and packs and stuff. The loading times on that one are also pretty crazy, but who knows, that might be fixed in a future update, or maybe we'll have to live with that, but again, you're not doing that type of workflow for every single session you do on this one. And just to be overly clear, everything about the circuit rhythm has to do with samples or sampling. It doesn't have any of the built-in synth modes that you can find on the original circuit or the circuit tracks. It's all about samples and audio. That's good to know. Now, the sequencer. And this is where the circuit rhythm pretty much acts like a drum machine. So basically you have two different ways of entering notes into the sequencer. One is just by recording them in manually by playing the pads, and the other one is to program stuff into the step sequencer located on the first 16 pads up here. So basically just pick a sound, place it on the step sequencer like that, for instance. Simple enough. And then you can also add more sounds to the same track by just holding another pad and placing it into the step sequencer like. And the sequencer also allows you to change stuff like the velocity, the gate length, or the probability of a sample even being triggered by just holding the step, pressing one of these and just changing, say, the probability to something in this range. That way you can get like more or less randomized patterns by using different probability settings for different notes. Kind of a cool feature. And I'm a huge fan of being able to record my drums or something like that totally unquantized into a sequencer. And that's a little bit of an issue on the circuit rhythm, so let's get into how that works. Let's clear this pattern and just start fresh with nothing but a hi-hat. So what you have here is what Novation calls micro steps. And that basically means that each and every step on this 16-step sequencer is divided into 6 micro steps per step. So let's get a hi-hat right here into my first step. Sounds like that. Now, if I go to the first one, for instance, and I go to my micro steps, I can choose 6 different steps on that single step. So it becomes like. And I can also choose to not include the first one and just do the second of these micro steps on these ones, for instance, like so. which obviously just moves your hi-hat to play a little bit later than the actual step on the sequencer, which is cool. But also kind of a limitation, because if I take all of these out and I try to record something manually here, that might be a little bit hard to hear, but what basically happens is that the circuit rhythm adjusts my different triggers to these 6 different micro steps per step, which gives me a resolution of the step sequencer that isn't truly unquantized, but maybe not too much an issue for most people. However, if I take this out again and then I choose to play my entire sequence at a lower rate, so I still want my 16 steps, but I want them to play back in half time, basically. That also affects the micro steps, so it scales together like that, which isn't always good. Let's get a kick in the snare here and try to record an unquantized pattern of the hi-hat in this mode. Again, maybe that's a little bit hard to hear, but it's not exactly the same stuff that gets played back as what I recorded into the sequencer. The notes are still sticking to these 6 micro steps per step. In this resolution it becomes kind of obvious, but there are workarounds here. You can use the step sequencer in double time mode, for instance, and have a finer resolution of a micro steps like that, and then chain different patterns together to build longer sections. But I'm not sure that I've seen any of the marketing material from Novation talking about this specifically. It says that it's unquantized, and I don't really think it's totally unquantized. Is it a big problem for most users? Is it a deal breaker? No, of course I don't think so. I just noticed it, and it bugs me a little bit that it's not completely unquantized, because that's how I like to work. Again, it is what it is, and not really a big issue, just wanted to point that out. So everything gets recorded into different patterns right here. They can be 16 steps long, like that, or they can be 32 steps long, like that. You have 2 pages of 16 steps, basically. One here and one here. So 32 steps like that, and then different patterns like this. You can chain different patterns together and having them play after one another to build a track like that, or repeat different patterns multiple times and make pretty much a full track using nothing but the circuit rhythm that way. This part of the sequencer, the playing back of the patterns, reminds me a little bit of Ableton Live's clip launcher view, which is cool and honestly kind of greatly integrated here. Just works, even though some of the patterns might be 16 and some of them might be 32 steps long. This just makes sense. Now, the last thing that I would like to see being improved in this one in the future firmware or whatever is the amount of effects that you have accessible to you. You have an effects page here that you can apply to the different tracks, but they all are different versions of delays and reverbs, which is good, but I just would love to see more stuff here that could, be applied to the different tracks and such. You do have an option to sidechain one thing to another and having the volume duck, like you know what sidechaining is. That's really cool, and you also have a bunch of different presets for that setting, which is a nice thing to have. And of course we also have the grid effects that are similar to what you can find on something like the MC707 that makes stuff glitch out or stutter or play in reverse or things in the entire unit on the main output. Sure, you can use those grid effects and resample the signal back to the unit and use them like that, but I would just love to see more effects being implemented on the different tracks. That's just a small little thing I would love to see in the future. I'm not saying that it's totally necessary because, it's kind of cool as it is right now, and this master filter here also affects the entire master out, so using that and playing around with the different grid effects makes a lot of sense for future live purposes. So even though the circuit rhythm might not be what I would call a powerhouse of a limitless sampler that competes with all the bigger, more expensive devices out on the market, I think this one really serves a good purpose, and I can definitely see myself throw this one in a backpack or even bring it on my summer vacation that's coming up pretty soon, by the way. And I mean, having something this small and lightweight with a built-in battery that's able to record samples and chop them up and sequence them and make something cool just like that on a piece of hardware, I honestly think this is a really cool product and it serves a purpose in the market. Definitely. And also keep in mind that Novation has a great track record of releasing software updates that has added more functionality to the different circuits back in the day. And maybe that's going to be the case for this one too, making it a little bit more responsive or whatever. And even if that's not the case, I can definitely see people like diving into everything about this one, finding the limitations and working around them and using nothing but the circuit rhythm and a bunch of samples and make some really, really great music. That's doable. So that's cool. And I think that's about everything I have to say right now about the new circuit rhythm from Novation. So thanks a lot for watching this video. Consider subscribing or even supporting me on Patreon. That would be cool. I hope to see you guys in the next video. Until then, ha det gott!
Accurate beats.